We are back after some days with the Caroline period in English literature. Caroline period, as you see in this chart, has been given in Renaissance column soon after Jacobean period that ended in 1625 when King James of England died. After his death, his son Charles ascended to the throne of England in 1625. This period has been named after him as Caroline period. Caroline is the Latin version of the English word Charles. This period is marked by turmoil and anarchy, and we know these stem from the previous period, Jacobean period, where his father dealt with two different groups in his parliament. The first group was parliamentarians who was opposing king for his claim of absolute authority, and the second group was supporting the king, and they were named as the supporters or the royalists of the king. So these two groups they had grave differences, and that led to them to a series of civil wars. The first civil war was fought in 1642, ended in 1646. The civil war was fought between these two groups in 1648, and the last civil war was fought in 1649 and ended in 1651. And the most importantly, in 1649, King Charles was arrested by the group of the parliamentarians. They were headed by Oliver Cromwell. So king was beheaded publicly. So these two groups, they had grave differences. They had named each other as well. So the royalists were named as Cavaliers by the parliamentarians. Why were they called Cavaliers? Because they were found most of the time as soldiers on horseback. Similarly, the king's supporters, called royalists, also named the parliamentarians as roundheads because they had a very particular kind of haircut in which their heads were found as were seen as round. So the main difference between these two was the royalists were the claim or notion that the king has the divine right, whereas the absolute authority is for him, whereas the parliamentarians were opposing this particular idea, and they were saying the supremacy of the country only belongs to the parliament, and it is over king's absolute authority. So as I mentioned earlier, that Oliver Cromwell headed the parliamentarians. He claimed or he named himself as the Lord Protector of the state, and he arrested the king and eventually beheaded him in 1649 publicly. So there was a religious group called the Puritans. So they also rose to the scene. They were organized and I must say exploited by Oliver Cromwell for his different wants, whatever politically he wanted. So when such things happened, the atmosphere was very tense. The theater was banned because the religious people had taken over the country. And similarly, there was no amusement. Amusement was prohibited in any form. We see in the literature of this age, the Cavalier poets are writing. They were also named as courtly poets. Why were they called courtly poets? Because they praised the king all the time in his court for his actions. So such poets, they also written lyric poets. They were also very much important for other writings like religious writings, which we are soon discussing in this particular lecture. Some famous names among them were the Richard Lovelace, John Suckling, Robert Herrick, and Thomas Carlyle. These important poets, Cavalier poets, were great admirers of another poet, Ben Jonson, and eventually the people or the poets or the literary men of the age named them as sons of Ben. They were also influenced by another great writer, John Donne, in that particular period. So these writers, as I have mentioned earlier, that they were secular in their thought, they also wrote about love, war, and religious themes. We also find another important form of poetry called metaphysical poetry. Metaphysical poetry is a poetry that deals with philosophical ideas such as love, life, and death. This particular poetry is characterized by intellectual depth, emotional intensity, and inventive use of language. Abraham Cole was considered their chief in physical poetry. So we also find that John Donne has written so much in this particular area of poetry. What sort of literary devices were used in this particular poetry of the age? We find conceit, paradox, allusion, personification, imagery, metaphors, and similes. Conceit is a kind of literary device that uses comparisons. It compares two different things by using extended or intellectual kind of metaphors. So the only difference between the conceit and the metaphors is that the metaphors is the direct or the simple kind of comparison between two unlike things, whereas conceit is the intellectual or the extended kind of comparison between two unlike things. And paradox is another important literary device that was used in metaphysical poetry. In paradox, what do? We contradict two different things, and that contradiction is actually to reveal some deeper thoughts or some deeper kind of truths. For example, separation can strengthen love. This statement, separation can strengthen love, at the surface it looks that it's some sort of vain saying how separation can strengthen love, but when we reflect deeply we can see that it is a kind of a statement that is revealing some sort of deeper thought. Third important literary device used in such poetry is allusion. What is allusion? Allusion is a kind of referencing, that when we reference to people, reference to places, reference to things, that referencing is termed as allusion. Personification is another important literary device used in metaphysical poetry of the age. Personification is actually we treat animal characters as persons. When we correct them, when we consider them as persons, so that particular consideration of the characters is termed as personification. Imagery is another important literary device used in metaphysical poetry of the age. Imagery deals with such text that actually makes it or enables things to feel by the readers. Means when they read, they can see things like, so that's imagery. Metaphors is simple sort of comparison to unlike things without using words as and like. Lastly, the word simile or the device simile is the comparison of two different things by using as and like as tools. So that's all for today's lecture. We will be discussing other literary periods soon after this. Thank you for listening.